Well, good evening and welcome to all of you joining us for our Theology and Peace quarterly speaker series. Tonight, we have Jonathan Foster with us, who Rebecca Adams will be doing a formal introduction. Just Theology and Peace, we do this quarterly. The other thing we do monthly is mimesis at the movies, which is a lot of fun. We watch a movie on our own and then come and talk about that movie. I think the next movie we're going to watch and talk about in the month or two is Free Guy. So we look forward to that as well. We have hosted an annual conference, and this year it may not be in person. We're still working out some of the details on that. But we have a history that goes back to, I think, 2007, 2008. And Theology and Peace had been gathering for annual conferences. And so we enjoy any input and any conversation. We have found these quarterly speaker series and the guests that we've had speaking to be absolutely engaging. And I myself, this evening, am really looking forward to open and relational theology. I'm on my on-ramp onto that new way of thinking. So I'm really looking forward to this event. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Rebecca, so that you can do a good introduction for Jonathan. Thank you.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know anything about Jonathan Foster, Jonathan works at the intersection of mimetic theory and open and relational theology. He's one of the first people to do so. And open and relational theology is an umbrella term that was coined in the 1990s by philosophical theologian Thomas J. Ord, who is Jonathan Foster's dissertation director. And it describes a new approach to understanding God. So open and relational theology can be likened to a paradigm shift in Thomas Kuhn's terms of the structure of scientific revolutions. He talked about paradigm shift. When you shift from one paradigm to another, it's often an abrupt kind of shift with a whole worldview that's different. So it's a paradigm shift from what has been called traditional classical theology. Now, classical theology, influenced by Greek thought, has tended to stress the omnis, such as God's omnipresence, God's omnipotence, and so forth, as well as God's immutability and impassibility, meaning God cannot change, God cannot be influenced in any way, and so forth. So open and relational theology takes a different approach. It offers a different cosmology. Cosmology is our big picture view of God and the fundamental structure of reality, hence the paradigm shift. However, open and relational thinkers believe their views, far from being heretical or strange, are both in keeping with the God depicted in Scripture and more in keeping with both our sense of ethics and a scientific evolutionary perspective. So the key differences between classical theology and open and relational theology or thought. Take the word open. Open. The future is open and not determined. God does not know what there is not there yet to be known. So God knows everything there is to be known, but the future has not happened yet. So creatures are free to make choices. Open theism, which is an early version or one branch of open and relational theology, stresses this aspect in particular, the openness of the future. Some open theists don't go much further than this issue about whether the future is open or determined. But open and relational theology, though it is a big tent, is in general influenced by philosopher Alfred North Whitehead's early 20th century process philosophy and Charles Hartshorne's process theology. These stress the profoundly interconnected and relational nature of reality, and God is the ground of that reality. So relational, let's take the word relational. God is profoundly relational. truly co-creating with free creatures at every moment. Open and relational thought puts an emphasis on God as fundamentally nonviolent, non-coercive love. So love rather than being. God is the ground of being, or being itself has been a major emphasis of classical theology. And also a stress upon God's power, being or power. Classical theology has tended to stress those as being the ultimate fact about God. In open and relational thought, God's power is always relational and non-coercive, hence the title of Jonathan Foster's book, Theology of Consent, Mimetic Theory in an Open and Relational Universe. So open and relational theologians would say these characteristics are more consistent with the overall picture of God in the Bible, for instance, and or they're more philosophically coherent. They also make better sense of ethics and human experience, in their view. We are not mere pawns or objects in a rigid God deterministic scheme. This general worldview of open and relational thought, that things are open, dynamic, and fundamentally free and intersubjective, has been adopted by some in other faiths, such as Judaism and Islam, and even atheistic or humanistic traditions. So not everyone in open and relational theology is Christian, although probably the majority of people are. In his work, Jonathan Foster thinks that God as non-coercive love fits with Girard's views and understanding of history. Girard stresses that from within our mimetic nature, we are nevertheless free to make choices. And he has an evolutionary view of revelation. So Girard sometimes is thought to be deterministic, but he says that that's not the case. He believes in free will. If you develop and extend Girard's thoughts on the imitation of a nonviolent God as being the antidote to violence, you could see how his thought begins to intersect with open and relational theology. In his dissertation, which later became his book, Theology of Consent, Mimetic Theory in an Open and Relational Universe, Jonathan developed some of his own insights about the implications of open and relational theology, and then weds those to insights about the importance of and potential of positive mimesis in Girard's thought. I saw his work in the dissertation phase and felt very excited about it, helping him to flesh out more fully and connect with what various people had said about positive or loving mimesis in the Girardian community. Had a little back and forth in editing mode, just giving some feedback. The other open and relational philosophical theologian working with Girard is André Rabe, also a doctoral student of Thomas Ord's. His book is Processing Mimetic Reality, Alfred North Whitehead and René Girard, which I edited. Both of these thinkers are doing really original work, and I hope you'll look at them both. So Jonathan's style of writing is also quite original. He weaves personal reflection into his scholarly work and writes in a poetic way. Theology of Consent was published in 2022. And in 2023, Jonathan published another experimental piece of writing, a long book-length, deeply personal poem, processing the tragic death of his 20-year-old daughter and giving rise to theological reflection from an open and relational point of view. Today, drawing on themes from his book Indigo, The Color of Grief, and his book Theology of Consent, Jonathan will take us through a reflection on God, grief, healing, and a little bit of René Girard in a philosophical meditation called The Nothing That Has Become Something. There'll be as we talked about among ourselves, there will be a Q&A of about 30 minutes after the talk, moderated by Theology and Peace member Ellen Corchella. So just put your responses and questions into the chat function, and she will field those for Jonathan. So welcome, Jonathan, and thank you so much for sharing such a deep and intimate topic with us.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, for that lovely announcement. Welcome, introduction. Can everyone hear me all right? All right. Yeah, it is really nice to be with you. I mean, any group called Theology and Peace, or I mean, right away, I know that we have a lot of resonance. So I love that. And as Rebecca said, she was a big help in the dissertation. We really kind of got connected for me super late in the game. And I think I've told you this, Rebecca, I was literally adding some of your insights in the day I hit submit. I was still adding some stuff. And it was honestly some of the most important things about what I wrote wound up being around the things you helped me with regard to positive mimesis and all of that. So thank you once again for your help. And everyone else probably knows it, but Rebecca's kind of a big deal in the Girardian world. I mean, she had a seminal interview with Renee back in the day. Was that the last century? Was that the end of the 90s, probably? So anyhow, that's for another story. But yeah, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for being here. Okay, so that was a mouthful. We won't be able to get into all of that, but it is true. We are going to talk about loss tonight and grief and beauty and life and who God might be and who I think that I've been trying to figure out who I am and relationship with God and others. And so it went through this dissertation process and a few other books and a bunch of sermons and a bunch of online classes and everything else. And then it wound up really kind of coming out in this just short 12,000 word little book called Indigo, the Color of Grief that came out at the end of 23. That's been received really, really well by lots of, lots of people. It's all relative. It can never be enough. So hopefully we get more. But everyone who's engaged with it has been really, really genuinely positive about it. So I'm really thankful for that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's kind of emerged from that and out of that experience and out of the experience of my life, which has been an experience of a lot of loss. I'm going to read a lot tonight, and I kind of hate doing that. I'd normally kind of a bit more free form, but the sequence of how I want to do this is important. So if you see me looking down a lot, and I'm afraid, my glasses are going to reflect the light, and I've been worried about all that, and finally decided I'm not going to worry about it. It is what it is, and you all seem like really gracious people, so it's going to be fine. And by the way, whatever I say tonight, I write better than anything I say. So if you just pick up the book or any of the books, you'll be better off anyhow. So I'm going to read through some of this. I'm also going to read a few excerpts from Indigo, The Color of Grief. I mentioned that to say I probably don't need to tell this group. We look like a seasoned group here. I may shed a tear. I don't think I will, and I'm not trying to, although I'm also trying not to either. I don't really care either way. I just sometimes let groups know up front because it is an intense subject. And by the way, this is the part that this group probably knows more than other groups. I've noticed over the years that when I do, my emotion kind of does overwhelm me. It's not always because I'm sad. A lot of times it's because I'm sad. Other times it's because this whole freaking thing we call life is so beautiful. I mean, there's so much beauty to it. And as kind of an artist at heart, sometimes I just get overwhelmed with all of it together. So I say all that to say that, people don't automatically just have to feel bad for me. You might even feel good for me if I shed a tear, and maybe you will too. I think that's a pretty good human response, especially in this day and age, for lots of folks who are trying to, especially for us masculine types, trying to suppress any emotion. I don't think that's particularly healthy. So anyhow, I just thought I'd mention that for what it's worth. I think this goes about 20, 25 minutes. And then, like Rebecca said, I'm happy to do Q&A for as long as we want. All right. So everybody, I just invite you to take a big breath with me. And just a long, nice exhale. and be present as we work through this thing that I'm calling the nothing that is something. All right. It was June 2015, and my little family of four, which is my partner and I, our 18-year-old and 13-year-old at the time, were in Colorado. So it was a trip I'll never forget, not just for the mountains, because we had been there many times. And wasn't just for the family spending time together. Thankfully, that had also happened a lot. No, it was a trip I'll never forget because, and you know what? I need to share my screen. I apologize because I want to give you guys this presentation at the same time. All right, all right, all right. There we go. Can all see that? Okay. The nothing, that is something. All right, so it was a trip I'll never forget because it was the first time away without our daughter. And as much as I enjoyed the four of us, it didn't feel right. And it didn't feel right because it wasn't right. I kept thinking about us as a unit. We were missing something. We were different. We were, as I began to think, 4/5. This is how I wrote about it in one of the chapters in Indigo, The Color of Grief. 4/5 became the reality in the span of a heartbeat. Her heart stopped beating in a span of a heartbeat, and we were 4/5, a fraction. A fraction doesn't work like a whole. Something, strike that, someone is missing. It's more than just someone missing. It's also the role that someone played. Her role in our family was something like a catalyst or initiator. We didn't assign the role. It's just who she was from day one. More wind than weather vane, more thermostat than thermometer. Like if the boys were mired in a mood, she could pull them out, but flip the script and boys had little chance. She was her own strong, intentional, capable person. Remember being with extended family once when great-grandmother fainted and passed out for a moment. She recovered quickly, but for a few minutes, we were unsure of how it would turn out. Several of the pre-teenage cousins ran to the basement, upset about the event, but even more upset about our girl not showing enough emotion regarding possibility that great-grandmother might no longer be alive. Their concerns escalated in volume and intensity until finally our girl stood up with fists pointed to the ground and announced to the whole group, "Look, I'll cry once we find out Grandma is actually dead." The room calmed. Apparently, the cousins thought the logic was sound. Yeah, she could change the environment when she wanted. Remember the first real trip we made as a fraction? Family vacation, playing board games. It was so awkward. At some point during the evening, I sat back and watched the four of us doing our best, learning how to interact without her. Less neurochemicals, less laughter, less volume too. An image materialized in my mind's eye, something revealing neurological activity within a group of people. Yes, some kind of visual spectrometer kind of thing, displaying the interaction that was bouncing around within a family of five doing life. You know, interacting, playing, arguing, talking, singing, taking trips together. Now, with her, there was a range of colors bursting across the display. Without her, areas were noticeably muted. More than that, there were specific areas of the visual projection, the thing displaying the interaction, bouncing around within a family of five doing life, you know, interacting, playing, arguing, talking, singing, taking trips together, that were completely dark. That night, after the board games, after the visual spectrometer kind of thing, yeah, that night was the worst. I couldn't relax. I couldn't sleep. Rotating ceiling fan slowly, shadow of cloud and moon. I'd get up and go somewhere, but there was no place to go, to get away from my thoughts, to get away from me, to get away. I kept thinking about the way she could light her brothers up. I kept thinking about their neurological activity changed forever. Marriage changed forever. Me changed forever. And I kept seeing dark spots on that stupid visual display. Effing interactive visual spectrometer thing. And I kept apologizing to whoever was listening for saying the F word. I just kept thinking about how much fun it all used to be before the day everything changed. So that was 4/5 chapter from Indigo. So it was this sense of missing, like the nothing that was there that captured my attention. So you have to think about it. Like she was there, but then she was gone. And that nothingness kept us from being who we were. Grief can be considered in many ways, and indeed in Indigo, I seek to do just that. But one way might be thought of is as a gap, a breach, a hole. It's where the loved one once was. But the thing is, your love still exists. But the person you used to receive and return that love is no longer present. It's an empty space. Love's still there, but it's just kind of like got nowhere to go. I wrote somewhere recently that grief is an ache that winds up going everywhere generally because it's a love that winds up going nowhere specifically. Grief is a nowhere, a hole, a void, where all of my love continues to rush out of. Now, in philosophical language, maybe we could use the word lack. And so, yes, I became intensely aware of the lack, intensely connected to its darkness and its emptiness. In some ways, it was the very last connection I had with my daughter. What a strange phenomenon. That love for my daughter included the whole of emptiness that has just never really left. So it was this thought, as much as anything, that catalyzed my need to write Indigo, the Color of Grief. How weird is that? When someone asks me, what inspired you to write the book? I can honestly say, nothing. Here are the opening pages of the book in a chapter called Absence. Absence is protagonist now. It's weird. Absence is nothing, a no thing, but it's very much something, a something. It has no form, but it forms me. It has no energy, but it energizes me. I'm full of its emptiness. It only now occurs to me, 99 months beyond Daughter of Lightning, Flash of Car Wreck, that all these words might be an attempt to absorb the shock, control the effect, fill the emptiness, as if the thingness of words can fill this wordless no thing. I have an image of my youngest son, maybe age 5, poolside, struggling to get a toy out of his pocket. He's wrestling wet shorts, hands reaching, turning round and round. I watch him for a whole hour 1 minute as he spins, never getting anywhere. A boy chasing an object like a dog chasing a tail, a world chasing a sun chasing a galaxy chasing a cosmos. That's me, trying to trap questions with my creeds, shadows with my candles, lightning with my eyes. That's me, trying to address the no thing with me, always. All right, now that I've located the no thing, the nothing in your mind, which is a weird sentence, I invite you to just to place it off to the side for a moment. So, like, do you see it? Nothing over there in the corner of your mind. There it is. It's nothing. It's over in the corner of your mind now. So I want to turn to the work of the aforementioned Rene Girard for a moment, which, as Rebecca mentioned, I have studied some. I am still studying and still trying to figure out all that he brings to the table. But I want to just kind of highlight something I think gets missed a lot with Girard, which is his connection with his friends in the world of theory. Now, to be honest, I'm not even sure what to call this group: structuralists, post-structuralists, psychoanalytic guys, theorists, people who have way too much time in their hands and then tend to talk a lot. I don't know really what to call all of them sometimes. But the point is that a casual reading of Girard leads some people to think that he created these ideas out of thin air, that he was just sitting around reading Proust and Dostoevsky one day, and he conjured up mimetic theory. And while I do think he sees something novel in Proust and Dostoevsky, maybe in ways no one else ever has, personally, and I don't know, this is something I probably need to vet a little bit more, but I just don't think there's any way he's not being influenced by the Hegels and the Freuds and the Jacques Lacans of the world. By the way, that's Jacques Lacan, not Shaka Khan. That joke never gets old. So it's Jacques Lacan in particular, who is interested with something called the lack. And I'm trying now to make this connection between this gap, this lack that I've already begun to talk about, and that I've been thinking about over the last few years. So Lacan is really interested in the lack. It's something he calls das Ding, which literally translated means the thing. And when I first heard this, I thought it was just such a silly name. It still might be, but it's kind of grown on me because in its generic nondescriptness, I see a certain connection to what I think Lacan was attempting to say. And I use the phrase what I think Lacan was attempting to say loosely, because the truth is, I don't really understand Lacan all that much. So I rely upon at least three friends to help me. My friend Tim Suttle here in Kansas City, who's a pastor, Peter Rollins, who you may have heard of and known, and then my friend Rick Boothby, who was someone who lost a son a few years ago. And it's in Rick's writing in particular that it's played a role in corroborating my thoughts on this absence stuff. So both Lacan and Girard are going to say similar kinds of things. Like we are constituted by the other. Primarily, they're going to say by the lack we perceive in the other. Now, it's Boothby that says that this mysterious, enigmatic lack both disturbs and enthralls us with the other. And initially, in Lacan's thinking at least, it's the lack we sense in our mother, and then in the other, which ultimately translates to God. So it's very interesting. In his book, Embracing the Void, Boothby teases out these ideas in very interesting ways. And he goes on to say that love itself is the commitment to the enigma of the other and the enigma of God. In other words, God herself, according to Boothby, must have a sense of unknowing, a void, a nothing, like a gap inside of him or her or it. In reading his thoughts about the space of a knowing within God, I got to tell you, actually, my heart leapt a little bit. I think I felt a little bit like Elizabeth, Mary's cousin. Do you remember that little passage in Luke? When Elizabeth heard the news of Mary's pregnancy, her son leapt within her. What a strange thing to have my heart lurch with the hope at the recognition of a no thing. But that's what happened. What I've been intuiting is a no thing, a very dark space, maybe even cave-like, death-like within me, but at the same time, a space that is directly connected with my daughter's absence. What I've been intuiting is the utter weirdness of grief entangled with love. And I've come to suspect that God herself has this same kind of entanglement with grief and love. And I thought of this, though this is not original with me, but I began to think of this as the whole within the whole, the HOLE inside of the WHOLE. And I love that little phrase, and I think it captures a lot of what I'm trying to wrestle with. So all this thinking was resonant with what I understood might be happening also, I should mention, in the life and death of Jesus. Jesus, the one who I think embodies this love in more interesting ways than anyone I've ever heard about, also experienced this nothing, for surely it's not a stretch to interpret his cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" as the cry of someone in direct contact with the no thing, the absolute terror of the HOLE within the WHOLE, the grief within the core of God. Well, you might be asking, so what? Which is a good question to ask just about anyone. So I've got three ways to respond to the so what, because that's what preachers do. You know, I don't know, it's written in the rules somewhere, you're supposed to have 3 points. So I got three things to respond to the so what. I'm going to spend less time on the first two, more time on the last. So what? Number one, all of this helps me feel at home with the darkness and not feel so isolated or kicked out or punished or separated from God. This has become extremely important to me. And by the way, I have a podcast, Jonathan_Foster, and my last episode, which is the last one I'm going to do for a few months because I'm taking a break, it's called Cheese in the Darkness. And it unpacks a little bit of this some more. So it helps me to feel at home with the darkness, which is not something I set out to do. This was not my plan. I don't think it's anyone's plan. But the truth is, I've been in that dark space, and I'm saying darkness now, and I'm using it synonymously with like the no thing, the nothing, the gap, the breach, the lack. I've been there so long that after a while, I just decided, oh, God's not pulling me out of this. There's got to be something else is going on here. And so it's been helpful to remember that I'm not there because I'm separate from God. So the no thing is not evidence of sin or any number of synonymous ideas of wrongdoing or immorality or being out of God's will or being unholy, though I'm certainly capable of all those things. No, it's more like the no thing, the nothing, has become something of a refraction of the luminous darkness, which, depending on who you read, that could be a Howard Thurman quote or a Buddha quote or St. John of the Cross. And actually, that line could probably be edited. It's not so much for me that the no thing is a refraction, is that as I live inside the no thing, like my own life becomes the refraction of the luminous darkness. And all of a sudden, the dark just kind of takes something like my eyes have adjusted, the dark takes on a whole new kind of meaning. So that's super fascinating. At least it is to me. Here's the second thing. It helps me be more rooted in compassion for the other. And I see much religious activity as an attempt, at least in our country, as an attempt to suppress the no thing, right? This anxiety, this gap, this breach, this lack, which winds up in a lot of dysfunctional behavior and denial, including the suppression of actual people. We might say marginalization. Yeah, I had a chance to talk to Dr. Marge Suhaki, and we talked a lot about compassion. It's empathy and action, according to her. And all of this kind of thinking has helped me bring compassion into the conversation. All right, here's a third thing that I'll spend a little more time on. All of this kind of thinking has helped infuse hope for maybe all of this lack and all this void and this gap stuff is revelatory of something deeper that we might step into in dimensions beyond this dimension. So I want to say something crazy like maybe heaven itself is a reframing of lives oriented around the no thing, a something that brings comfort and instills hope for the future. Now, to illustrate this point, I turn to that old holiness cinema classic, Star Wars, episode 4, A New Hope. Now, the show came out in 1977. Can you believe that? 1977. Now, I did not see the show when it came out, of course, because I came from the old holiness Nazarene tradition where we made a practice of denying ourselves access to films that celebrated such lack, such darkness, such nothingness. But in a plot twist, eventually, I did see the show, a bootlegged VHS copy, ironically, at my youth pastor's house. Oh, the deep and mysterious ways of love. Anyhow, as you may remember, I'm sure everyone has seen Star Wars here, Obi-Wan Kenobi responds to Luke's questioning about his father at one point in the movie by saying, Darth Vader betrayed and murdered your father. Now that response takes on a whole new meaning once that iconic line is spoken, or excuse me, that takes on a whole new meaning once that iconic line is spoken. Y'all know the iconic line I'm talking about. Luke, I am your, say it with me, father. That's right. So that knowledge that Darth Vader is Luke's dad, it reframes Obi-Wan Kenobi's line earlier in the show when he said Darth Vader betrayed and murdered your father. By the end of the show, we realize what Obi-Wan Kenobi was saying. So it reframes Obi-Wan Kenobi's line, but more than that, it reframes the entire story. And once that information is revealed, it brings a sense of meaning and enjoyment to the entire movie. Suddenly, in a nanosecond, the viewer has a flashback, almost like a wave at the speed of light, scanning back through the movie and then forward again up until the present. And instantly everything feels different because you're selecting out all the clues that you had missed. Oh, you think, no wonder Obi-Wan Kenobi responded to Luke in such a weird way. No wonder things like Luke and Princess Leia never really hit it off romantically. No wonder Luke has powers. That line provided a way for viewers to go back and find meaning. In a moment, the viewer recognizes the depth, the nuance, the creativity of what has gone on before. And here's the thing, the viewer loves it. The film practically announces that it's organized around a lack, a no thing, i.e., lack of truth on Obi-Wan Kenobi's part and lack of Luke having a father, which winds up being the why or the drive to figure everything out for Luke. It's his motivation. All of that is placed there by this gap, the nothing, the lack of information. And it also points at the same time to more questions. As you get these blanks filled in, more questions are brought up in your mind. It prompts you to search more because the search for more always leads to the search for more. Now, that's a good philosophical line. There's a lot of truth there. The search for more always leads to the search for more. In some ways, that's what the culture has been doing for the past, I don't know how long it's been. It's been 45, 50 years since 1977. Someone will have to do the math. That's what our culture's been doing. There's all these new shows, more backstory, more spin-offs, more t-shirts, cartoons, merch. Just last night, I was on the Disney Plus app, and I noticed, I didn't count them. I should have. I mean, there had to have been, I'm picturing now like 6, 7 shows across, 4 or 5 deep. There must have been 30 different shows on the Disney Plus app right now that are all iterations of Star Wars. We keep wanting more and more and more because we're so thrilled by this lack that turned out to be something that reoriented our meaning. All right. I'm fixing to get to the end here, so we're almost done. You guys are doing good. What does all this say about our lives? What does it say about my life? Well, my life, and by the way, I'm not trying to say that I've had it worse than others, but I'm also not trying to say I've had it better than others. I try not to play the comparison game. It is what it is. I will just tell you my experience. My life has been organized around voids, no things, lack. My whole adult life, murders, houses burning down, a best friend that died, living paycheck to paycheck, planning churches, life-threatening illnesses to our children, our daughter died, all of that stuff and more fueled theological changes that got me officially kicked out of my denomination. I lost paycheck and I lost the estimation of friends. And because I was a third generation denominational pastor, I lost what I sometimes call as generational estimation. It was a lot. And then I had a niece that died, and then my mom died, and then COVID, and then my father died, all the while doing the work we started down in Haiti 10 years ago that honestly never ceases to be a fight with their lack of resources, their lack of safety in hurricanes, their lack of opportunity, and now their stinking political lack that has turned into a full-scale humanitarian crisis down there. I've experienced all of this while experiencing a lack of God's response in fixing these things. So I wrote that sentence intentionally. I've experienced all this lack while also experiencing a lack of God's response in fixing these things. To the point where I started staying along with that Jewish saint, I call her a saint, that young lady who died in the concentration camps. Her name's Hillesum, and she died about the age of what my daughter would be right now if my daughter was alive. And you may have heard this line. It's a profound line. It's a stunning line. She says, but one thing is becoming increasingly clear to me, that you, God, cannot help us. Alas, there doesn't seem to be much you yourself can do about our circumstances, about our lives. Neither do I hold you responsible. You cannot help us, but we must help you and defend your dwelling place inside us to the last. Oh my gosh, I love that line. I mean, I hate that line and I love that line all at the same time. Neither do I hold you responsible. You can't help us, but we must help you and defend your dwelling place inside us to the last. So the lack, the gap, the void, the nothing, it's real, and yet, there is something that has formed out of the nothing, because this is my lived experience. The absence has become a type of presence and has motivated me in ways that I wouldn't be motivated without its non-presence presence. You understand what I'm trying to say? It's motivated me in a way that I wouldn't have been without its non-presence presence. Okay, a little side note. This is all thinking. I shouldn't say all of it. The general thing I'm talking about here is congruent with both scripture and with science for those of us who care about the scriptures and science. Regarding scriptural texts, contrary to popular belief, the earliest tradition in Christianity did not interpret Genesis 1:2, the Hebrew phrase is tohu vabohu, as a complete nothing. I mean, they might have meant nothing in the sense that it wasn't a thing, but not nothing in the sense that literally nothing existed. So God didn't create out of nothing, because nothing has never, there's always been a something. This is also thinking that is congruent with our best science. A vacuum, for example, is said to be empty, and yet the quantum physicist notes a certain fluctuation of energy. Now, it might be microscopic, but there's something there. So the point is, neither biblical cosmology nor quantum physics, necessitates a complete lack of matter before Genesis 1. If the physicist is roughly saying the same thing as the early church tradition, which roughly matches up to my lived experience, well, it's not a guarantee, but it's enough for me to say that by faith, maybe heaven is. Well, of course, it's not sitting around playing harps. Rather, it'll be things revealed to us that will help reframe our life and give us a sense of enjoyment about the lack we lived through. But even more, give us insight in how to live further. For I suspect that heaven isn't the end, but the beginning of some entire new adventure that is itself possibly maybe oriented around some kind of no thing, a deeper whole within a greater whole, a deeper H-O-L-E inside a greater W-H-O-L-E. And here's my big ending. Y'all are going to want to say amen after this, I hope. The good news is the lack might just be the depth. The incompleteness just might be the completeness. The end might be the beginning. Death might be life. And the no thing, it just might be evidence of a something beyond even our wildest imaginations. There you go. The end. I know that was a lot, and we could talk about all kinds of things, so let's do it.
No, one, it was beautiful. The writing was beautiful. The metaphors and the metaphoric thinking is beautiful. Very touched by what you've written. I didn't know that was going to happen when I came into it. So I know at one point, so I've done a lot of study of trauma-informed care. I was a chaplain in a trauma hospital, acute hospital, on and off for 10 years. And so one of the things that it sounds like your transition point was when you began to accept that the absence or the no thing was not going to go away.
No.
And so it was for me, and I've done some writing about it, but for many, I think it's the recognition that instead of trying to get away from the trauma, it's recognition that no, the trauma is going to stay there. How do we move forward encompassing that? And it sounds they've done enormous amount of reflections after that. But could you speak maybe a little more about that experience of that transition, what it feels like to move into, I don't want to say acceptance as in 5 stages of grief, but acceptance as in recognizing that where I was before doesn't exist before now, I exist with something different. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does. It's it's a really good question slash comment, and I think it's extremely important for lots of different reasons, not the least of which is most of the Western religious movement is, at least Christian, is kind of oriented around this idea that, God is light, and that, anytime you experience something bad, I'm oversimplifying, but I'll just do so to make a
No,
point.
it's okay.
Um, anything, you do something bad, you're introducing darkness, or you're stepping into darkness, and it's only a matter of time before God, who is the Savior, and pure light itself, will come in and will, I don't know, do whatever light does and eradicate all of that. And all of that works against this thing you're talking about, this acceptance piece. And also all of it has to be questioned because, again, my lived experience is it's been years and years and years. Now, I'm not suggesting that I've done everything perfectly, but I feel like I probably know as well as anyone. I've lived as well as I possibly could have this whole time, and and that sense of darkness, that sense of that gap and that loneliness and that brokenness is never really left. And part of it, when it's attached to my daughter, that piece of it, it's odd. It sounds odd to say this. There's a part of it I kind of don't want it to actually go because that's the last part I have connected with my child. So that's a whole strange thing too. But I think, yes, something about the acceptance, something about recognizing, okay, this is the reality, this is the situation. I love someone's definition of forgiveness. I don't remember who said this, but forgiveness is giving up hope that the past will ever be any different. And so now it's I started to say job. I don't like that. It's like my privilege. I am now being invited. It's an honor for me then to bring this idea into the present. Like, okay, the past, I can't change that. That can't be changed. But it also doesn't mean that I'm doing a million things wrong. It just means this is the reality. And maybe God is in the dark as much as God is in the light. And that opens up a whole new line of thinking, and that's been super helpful for me.
I had not heard that quote before, but it reminded me of something I've thought a lot about, and that is that, and again, some of what I heard you talk about earlier today, which it's what I had to learn as a chaplain, what you bring into chaplaincy in the acute care hospital, that theology doesn't always work in these great moments of grief. It doesn't hit the ground well. People are all worried about being saved and judgment. And, I learned that, you just let them know that they're loved. The other thing that's, in maybe I'm saying it in a positive fashion, but you're saying using the absence thing. But the other thing is that who is God and what is our role in conveying God? And that's that fix-it thing. So prior to being a minister, I was in a fix-it profession, let's just put it that way. And so I had to really learn what it means to be. And so it sounds like you've been thinking about a little bit of that. We're so quick to want to fix. And what I learned was people want us to be with them. And maybe that's what God's role is to be. And not to fix, and whether, I do like that part about our role is to help God, but that's also not a very Western thought that, God's there to fix. He's either he or she's responsible for what happened or is there to fix it. And then we become fixers when really what we need is to be beers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I really love that. And theologically, a lot of my life shifted when I really began to take all this kind of thinking into my thoughts about what was happening at the crucifixion. And I finally decided that the cross isn't the place where everything gets fixed. The cross is the place where God holds everything together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that one idea fundamentally shifted basically the entirety of my theological foundation. And it's all of that is because of grief. And so now I'm not sure which came first, but to your point, yes. And like grief, I realized this thing's never really going to be fixed. All I could really do is just try to carry it well. And then I guess I started
I
thinking,
love that. Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of probably what I think that's probably a bit of what's going on with God too. But that doesn't mean healing doesn't come. It just means
Right.
it comes in really strange, circuitous ways. But also, the sacred text says that love is patient, and so it never gives up. So it's these strange, odd paths where we go on. So I still have faith that stuff can continue to be healed, but just not in the way I originally thought it was going to be.
Right, right, right.
I appreciated your comment about God lacking. And I have to wonder if when God sees us grieving, if that love, that relation is essentially what's happening. It's like, I love you and I don't want to see you go through this, but I am not going to pull puppet strings, because if I pull puppet strings, you'll never grow as a human being. You'll never evolve and have the realizations like what you're talking about. I lost my wife 3 years ago. We were on a honeymoon for 14 years. And when I say honeymoon, we never argued, we never anything. We woke up in the middle of COVID. I'm so glad you're here. I'm excited. Every day was like the first day. It's a tremendous loss. It's one that never goes away. I've written some too. But when you start healing the grief and you're like, oh, part of the healing is going, no, the grief isn't going to go away. But what you learn from that is beneficial, not just to you, but it's a thing, as you're doing now, you're turning around and giving it to the rest of us. Like, oh, here's a new way to think. Here's something I'm learning how to deal with the darkness. The dark night of the soul does not have to be an absolute, I'm never going to see the light again. I just may see the light in a different way. It may not be that glorious angels singing thing that maybe we thought it was. It's okay if it's more realistic. So I'll say I appreciate your realism, and I appreciate your openness. It's like, it's obvious to me, well, you're open to the world. It's like, well, okay, what are we getting into now? And that you've found some ways, and I'm sure you'll find more, to take the love of your daughter and ensure that that's with you in every interaction you have with another human being and every interaction you have with God. And I think that's a wonderful expression of relational theology. A small book of prayers I wrote that I dedicated to my wife started with one statement: with your footprints in my heart, I will love the world as you have loved me, with joy and compassion, as a way to say, I will take you with me. Anyway, thank you. Yeah, I guess I have some more books on my book list.
Yes.
You're absolutely delightful, and I appreciate your inquisitive way. That's enough for me.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I have a question in the chat from Rebecca. And so, and she says she's wondering if entering into the process of loving or positive mimesis might be the same thing as staying present to one's experience of the nothing or lack and not fighting it, yet becoming conscious of it and working with it towards insight and more wholeness.
Yeah, I suspect that that's probably true. And, you know, to be honest, I've never sat down and thought loving mimesis and then thought,
Right.
what does this say about grief and what does grief say about this? But knowing Rebecca, of course, she's going to ask that. And I think so. I think love is generative and mimesis is this imitation piece. Jesus says he's only doing what he sees his Father doing. His Father is love. The text says God is love.
Mm-hmm.
if love has a gap, a breach in it,
Mhm,
all of that's being reflected and imitated
mhm.
all at the same time with everything else. So I definitely think there's a whole
Right.
bunch of stuff to excavate there.
I'm also wondering if at what you're teaching us and through your process is maybe there's a tendency, and Rebecca, I know I'm probably not using the right subjective objective model, not model, but when we fight with the grief, right? We don't want it, we go away, it becomes our rival, right? And so
Mm.
maybe sometimes that stuff you were talking about, the maladaptive ways in which we contort ourselves to fit into this model that's been taught to us. Like you've got like 6 weeks to grieve and then you got to go on with it or whatever. It becomes our rival and it causes more conflict than if we, or the sense of being traumatized, kind of once you accept it, it's, it's less a fight in a way.
I'll say something, and Rebecca
Yeah, go
maybe
ahead.
more, but yeah, absolutely. Maladaptive, mimetic. I mean, the mimesis is this process of imitating and then desiring what the other desires. And when we have an entire culture, including a religious culture, that keeps putting people up front who seem to be put together, who have no gaps, who have no lacks, who have no breaches, who have no voids or nothings. They seem to have it all. We keep imitating this
Right.
fake kind of a thing, and it doesn't help us. It
Mhm.
kicks the can further down the street, so to speak, in us dealing with their stuff. And then that's why all of us have had conversations, privately with our counselors or with pastors, or some of us have been counselors and pastors. We've
Mhm.
had conversations with others. It and those kind of conversations don't line up with, a lot of what you hear coming from the
Mhm.
spiritual leaders, or the
Mhm.
economic leaders, the political leaders. It's this constant promotion of, I have achieved something. I don't have any lack. That's what we desire.
Mhm.
And it's false. It's not right. So
Mhm.
I think a loving mimesis has a strong self-awareness that, yeah, like Girard was said, there is no such thing as a non-lacking subject. Like we all, even when we're following Jesus, we're going to have gaps and breaches and insecurities and anxieties,
Mhm.
something like that.
I could
Mhm.
say something about the other open and relational theologian that I mentioned was Andre Rabe. And in his book, Processing Mimetic Reality, the thing that struck me the most, that I took away the most from the book, was his discussion of lack.
Mm.
And he talked about how we can see lack as being something that we always have. Now, he's drawing from a process point of view, that lack could be seen as something that creates mimetic rivalry because we feel we lack something and we're trying to fill that hole. But he said that there's another way to understand lack, and from a process point of view, and that is simply that it's the unfinishedness of things, and it is the potential toward the future. So it is this openness that I mentioned in the introduction, the openness for the future in open and relational thought, that there's always, we could always be more, we could always have more experiences, we could always be more than we are now, and in a way that means we're lacking something now, but that wouldn't have to be a negative thing at all. That would just kind of be our existential state of being in the process of becoming. So that's what I took away from his discussion of lack, that I felt that was really powerful. Because he had a whole way, instead of saying, oh, no, we don't lack anything, he was saying, no, we redefine lack
Yeah,
as being the cutting edge of how we respond.
yeah,
Um, and that it's what constitutes us in relation to God, and the future unfolding every minute in in relation to the divine, when with us as co-creators.
yeah. And I'm thinking that's such a great point, Rebecca. I'm thinking a part of the transformation that happens in a human's life that is imitating the life of Jesus and is orienting their lives around love it's that transformation of lack. Starts to move from this, Girard says, this dark country of anxiety that subsists within us and never ceases to, I can't remember what's the end of that quote, never ceases to stop basically pressuring us. It starts to move from that to exactly what you're saying is, but it doesn't go away. There's still some kind of breach, but now we're seeing it as this thing that helps me move forward. It's a motivation. I've not quite arrived, and God's in the middle of all of that. And because of that, then that leads to other conversations like the future is potentially open because of all of that. That is really beautiful. That's really good stuff.
Yeah, and well, that's Andre's ideas, not mine, so I credit him.
Yeah.
Another person has a question. Does not love ultimately erase the perception of lack that would otherwise dominate our focus?
Does love erase our perception of lack?
Our perception of lack that could otherwise dominate us.
So what I'm trying to say is basically no, that lack. I mean, part of our problem here is, first of all, these are deep waters we're wading in. So if we're feeling like we're in over our heads, you're probably not alone. I probably am too. And part of the problem is also that we're kind of using synonymous terms. But what I want to say ultimately is that no, there's a lack. There's always an element of, it's part of being human, is having this a bit of something's not quite all put together. And I think that part of the reason that's the case is because we come from love. And what I'm suggesting is that love itself has an element of antagonism in it, that always, I think of like kaleidoscopic, like it's always falling in on itself. And even when Jesus is at the cross, he's going deep into the heart of this whole thing. He's falling in. He's not saved. He dies, although something really beautiful and incredible happens later, and because of all of it. So it's not so much that I'm thinking that love then eradicates or gets rid of or fills the lack, as much as there's an element of this nothingness that turns out to be something within love itself.
I was thinking about what you said about your tears at the beginning, that sometimes you would be in tears because things are so beautiful. And it's staying present to one's experience, you can feel a combination of grief or sorrow with gratitude.
Yeah, I think of grief and beauty as two sides of the same coin, which I think the coin is love. But grief and beauty for me are they're forever interlinked and entangled in very strange, interesting ways.
So when you read Girard, or do you relate or think of, or have you thought of the no thing as being the same as the absence of the victim once the scapegoating happens? So they explain it this way. In a way, it seems the archaic sacred might be described as a community's orientation around the absence. That would be the victim's expulsion that becomes a thing, the deity.
That's kind of interesting. I hadn't thought of that in those terms. Right, with mimetic theory, with Girardian thinking, once the victim is gone, so there's a lack, there's an absence, and then that absence becomes sacralized. Of course, in that sense, it's not particularly healthy. So
Right.
I'd have to think through that. But it may work in healthy and in unhealthy ways. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Right.
It
So
also
it
might be also worth thinking about that whole movement, in a sense, happens because we are not comfortable with our own insecurities, our own existential angst. And because of that, in my understanding, all that existential angst is what triggers the entire scapegoating mechanism. And we'll go to all these great lengths to offload all of our psychospiritual problems onto the other person, get rid of them. That's all because we are not comfortable, so to speak, in just living with our own lack, our own gap, our own breach. And then created, American Christianity, Western Christianity created original sin. And then you had to slot Jesus in as literally the person who makes up for that gap. And so, yeah, there's some really interesting ways these are really interesting conversations, how it intersects with Girardian stuff.
Yeah, that's a good question. Good thought there. I want to read from Andy. It's very much a compliment, but Andy notes that I like how this parallels the anti-racism care we have these days, or concern care these days around simply associating dark with evil and light with good. Your insights today add so much depth to these conversations.
Yes, this is so fascinating to me. In my podcast episode, I talk a little bit more about this, but over the last couple of years, I've just been collecting more and more quotes and thoughts and poems, and even some scripture that helps us see that darkness. Yeah, we use it like black, white, good, bad, moral, immoral. It's incredibly important. I think the people who are maturing in their faith and in evolving in their, I want to say, intelligence or something, are seeing the breakdown of all that. It's not, everything is not binary. There's so much non-binary going on, non-linear going on. And Psalm 139 has been incredibly helpful for me. It's actually the first scripture I quoted when I realized we were about to hear the news that our daughter had died. But in that psalm, the psalmist says that dark has become like light, like for God. So what we thought was dark, and it's back to this luminous darkness thing. And so whatever we all can do to continue to antagonize this dual binary polarity thing, I think is artistic, it's beautiful, it's good work, it's hard work, and it'll put you, it's very difficult. It'll put you in the crosshairs because most of our culture doesn't want to hear about anything in the middle. They wanted to go one way or the other and then label it.
I guess I hadn't noticed that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it seems there's a whole bunch of stuff going on to avoid responsibility, solving problems, and pushing it off onto these other places. But but your mention of art, so we have an observation here. As an artist, I think often about the fact that light passing through matter casts a shadow. I don't think love can become, this is their view, I don't think love can become incarnate without that absence of also being brought into being. So yeah, light does cast a shadow.
And so the comment is love can't become what it wants to become.
Incarnate, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And that also this incarnate peace, I think love, what I think is that love, it's this beautiful, in some ways, abstract thing, but it's always seeking to express itself down into the most specific ways. I'm thinking now of the end of my hands as I reach out to someone else, or my feet as I go to share compassion or good news to someone. So it can't just live in this abstract. It's got to be expressed. And whenever it gets expressed into matter and through matter, it is going to go through difficulty. There's just no way. And so you have all of a sudden this interplay of light and shadows that's constantly going on in micro and macro ways. So I really like, whatever they said, I really like,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, before I get to your question, Wes, I was just going to interject something here based on what you and January just talking about. I will also say that sometimes we can feel God's presence almost more in those darker times, right? So my experience in many ways, let's just use it as a chaplain, was when that presence being present thing really worked and you could kind of be the conveyor of God's love. Those are some of the most um, transcendent moments that I've ever experienced, right? But it was not in a good, it wasn't in a good place. I mean, there's trauma that's happening. The person is not well. There's some despair. There's existential, all that stuff going on. So there is something about God coming into the darkness. You know, light came to the darkness, and but I think, yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that a lot.
Well, I would just say, first of all, I do think that's true. Also, what I am trying to say is maybe even something deeper, that God doesn't have to come into that. God's already there.
Well,
Uh,
yes, you're right.
so Rebecca mentioned earlier, open relational, we're not too excited about the omnis.
Right.
Uh, I'm very excited about omnipresence. I think
Yes.
omnipresence is a big deal. I'm not so excited about omnipotence nor omniscience, but I think omnipresence is incredibly important. And so then there's something that happens. So you're right. I do think there are moments of transcendence in the dark because of God's omnipresence,
Mm-hmm.
but also, and also, not but, and also, some of us go long amounts of time without
Mm-hmm.
or experiencing anything transcendent. And
Mm-hmm.
but what's fascinating for me is, I'll just speak for myself.
Yeah.
Um, I don't hear from God a lot,
Mm-hmm.
but I pay attention, and the paying attention to the nothing has formed me. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's another way of saying nothing has become something.
Mm-hmm.
That's super fascinating. That's not what I set out for, but that's what's happened because I haven't been able to and I haven't wanted to let go. Is that the right way of saying it? And I felt like love was present. It's just I don't always sense it, but something about all of that creates some kind of energy. So yeah, yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah. And I'm not for all the omnis either. It's probably just the way we get used to speaking about God showing up, right? When in fact
Yeah.
God's there. You know, I don't want to suggest that, yeah, I don't believe in all that either. But I did tell you I went to a process theology school. So
Yeah, I wasn't trying to make you feel bad.
yeah, no, but
I was trying to make a point. Yeah.
yeah, no, absolutely. It's fascinating. We have a question here about how does embracing the lack, no thing, speak to those in a more concrete way who lack basic necessities, access, power, social standing, and things like that. So putting it in more of a social uh, justice context.
That is a
Not,
great.
yeah,
First of all, while I'm thinking of it, y'all know probably Mother Teresa. What did she say? We found out reading her
right.
memoirs or whatever after she died that she said she didn't hear from God for like 50 years or something like that, you know. So I think that's all congruent. Okay, what does the lack say about the justice piece? Because, okay, here's where my mind went. Based on that question, someone could say, oh, Jonathan, you're saying the lack, we should accept the lack. And therefore, if I don't have stuff like you have stuff, and you, Jonathan, are a straight, white, male, American, relatively affluent, um, relatively, I'd like to add that word. And so you check all the power boxes. So what do we say to people who are experiencing lack? Yeah, whatever I'm trying to say, I would never want it to be misused in a way to hold that over people or suggest to people who don't have things, especially their basic necessities. I would never want to suggest that they are forced to stay in that position. So that's a great question. I'm gonna have
I'm
to think.
wondering if, and maybe Wes, you can elaborate a bit, but I think it depends on what we're defining the lack or no thing to be.
Right.
I mean, it seems you're talking about it as a lack, as in a spiritual, almost like a spiritual lack or emotional lack. And then the question of somebody lacking basic necessities is a concrete absence of something that's needed. And then how to reconcile those two different definitions.
Right.
If they are two different definitions.
Yeah, we are kind of we're using these concepts artfully and loosely, so it makes it difficult. But even hearing you kind of talk about it some more. Okay, first of all, Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor. Blessed are you when you mourn. Blessed are the brokenhearted. Blessed are you hunger and thirst." So these are Jesus' words, not mine. Now, it would be immoral for me, who checks all the power boxes, to try to tell, like I'm thinking now of my Haitian friends who are in, you know, just in the middle of this terrible thing. It would be immoral for me to suggest that, oh, you don't have anything to worry about. You know, Jesus says you're blessed. It would also be maybe immoral. I don't know if that's the right word. It would be misguided for me to not remind them that there are more important things than maybe some of what they're dealing with. Or it would be immoral for me not to, maybe this is a better way to respond, for me not to enter into it with them.
Yeah, that is a conundrum. I'm actually a transgendered male, but even so, I walk around in the world and I also can check most of the power boxes because I pass, so I can wander around. I've also spent time with Mother Teresa's group, and I've spent time in Calcutta. And yeah, the poor are blessed, but it's a matter of when you hit that nothingness point where you don't have anything, you're all the way at the bottom. That gives you all the room in the world internally to see and hear how you're being spoken to by God as it is in the world. If you go to a place like Calcutta, I guarantee you, you will never fail to believe in God again. It's everywhere. It's smelly, it's stinky, it's noisy, but somehow you just know it is a spiritual hub. But again, when you're in the nothingness, that's where it really is. That's where what you've said today, this is where your grief has evolved. This is where your thoughts about how you relate to God and others connect. That is a blessing. It is true that there are people, particularly in the United States, that are unfinished. And so they're not going to understand the difference. And they're going to say, what do you mean I'm blessed because I'm poor? I don't have a check. I don't have my bills paid. And you're right. I think the best thing is just, go there with them. God doesn't force us to realize or understand something. God gives us the room to find it for ourselves. Is that not our obligation to others and our connection to others to go, oh, in this space, I need to give them room to find it for themselves. And if they want to talk about it, great. And if they don't, I can still hold my hands behind them for something. So, just my thought.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Shane. Amipotence, which I think is different from omnipotent.
Yeah.
May be our relief from grief, though not eradicating grief, but nonetheless accompanying us in the nothing.
Yeah, amipotence is a phrase, a word coined by Thomas J. Ord, and it's he's trying to posit that God's not omnipotent, which places power at the top of everything,
Mhm.
authority, power, but
Mhm.
it puts love.
Oh, Ami, yeah.
Yeah. So the word ami, like you would use in amigo or amore or like
Right.
friend, it's this love power, and relational power becomes the thing.
Mhm.
So for those who aren't familiar with that word, that's what that is. So amipotence or omnipotence. So anyhow, now I forget what was the question or the comment. Maybe
Well,
this.
I'm not, does this love power, okay, we'll call it that, is that our relief from grief? It doesn't eradicate grief, but it accompanies us in the nothingness. So the love accompanies us in the nothingness. I think that may be what you're saying, Shane. I don't want to misinterpret it, but trying to do the best I can.
Yeah. So what I think is that it doesn't eradicate it. It doesn't fix it again. But it's with us, and that's something really powerful. So we always want solutions.
Mm-hmm.
I'll speak for myself. I always want solutions, but I think solidarity is greater than solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
a solution will fix a thing for a while, but solidarity is coming alongside of someone else, and now creativity is uh, generated, and new potential is generated, and compassion is generated. All these things happen in solidarity. So I would want to say something less about, yeah, and I'm not saying Shane is saying this, but just to be clear, less about fixing, and it just it goes with us.
Mm-hmm.
It's this deep presence, and it is. There's several things that changed my life, but I don't know if there's anything more powerful. And in when you read Indigo, you'll read about this. But on the night that my daughter died, so earlier that day, I had read Elie Wiesel's book called,
Mm-hmm.
this is nice, Night. If you haven't read
Mm-hmm.
Night, you haven't read literature. It's like
Mm-hmm.
it's it's stunning and beautiful. Um, and in that story, Wiesel recounts this crazy thing that happened in the concentration camps. Some of you may have heard about it, where they were forced to march underneath three Jewish men. One of them was like a 12-year-old boy that were being hanged.
Mm-hmm.
Absurd, ridiculous thing. So it's on New Year's Day morning before sunrise in 2015. I'm reading this, thinking this is kind of a strange way to start this new year. As Wiesel walks underneath those men and that boy being hung or hanged, whatever the proper way of using the word hung there is, he hears a voice crying out behind him that says, "Where is God?" And in Wiesel's mind, he says he hears this call in response, "Where's God?" He's hanging there in the gallows with those boys.
Mm-hmm.
And so all that day, that call and response was echoing back and forth in my mind. Where is God? He's hanging on the gallows with those boys. And I just kept thinking, this is like, I wasn't trying to think about it. I was also not trying not to think about it. It just kind of hung there. And then, of course, that was the day that our daughter Quincy died. And that we got that news around, we really officially didn't get it till around 8 or 9 o'clock at night. So at about 10 o'clock at night, I was packing up the car because we were at my mother-in-law's farmhouse. We were coming home from there. We decided to come back to Kansas City. And that same call and response that I'd been hearing all day, I heard again. Where was God? Except this time the response was, where was God? He was in the car dying with Quincy. So she died in a car wreck. And I've never, I've never just really gotten away from that. So God was present, the solidarity of God, which introduces, there's a ton of implications. There's so much antagonism involved in that. That's so much different than the normal, theological, ecclesiological way we
Right,
approach
right,
these things.
right.
It just messed me up for good from the beginning. Like, what does that mean? What does that say? And so it's that solidarity piece. And since then, I've decided couple of different times that I've become an atheist in the God that I used to believe in, but
Mhm.
and I felt forsaken by the God I used to believe in, but I have never felt forsaken by love. I have never once felt like love has left me. I felt like that old God that I had conjured up left me, and a bunch of people left me. I've never felt that about love. That gives me hope. If love never leaves us, and that's what our sacred text says too. If love never leaves us, then maybe there's something unimaginable and something we can't even comprehend that's still going to happen because something is going to be generated in this really beautiful relationship of love between God and all the creatures, not just humans, but all entities that have ever existed. Sorry, that was a long comment.
No, 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 it's beautiful. And it would explain maybe your and this effort to believe in God is more relation, right? That's a relationship, right?
Yeah, definitely. It definitely plays into that for sure.
Right. Um, a God who stays with us, a friend who stays with us, a relative who stays with us. It's all part of an ongoing relationship and stays with us in the best and worst of times.
Mhm.
Can I just say a quick thing? I wonder if what the power of the resurrection is this absolute fidelity within the circumstances of life. That God is present to us as a living presence, and we can be that to each other.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. There's so many different, the resurrection idea is like, to me, it's prismatic truth. Like light shines through a prism, and depending on where you're at, it's going to refract so many different ways. And one of those things I think you just touched upon. If we can be present to this possibility that something good could come out of this. I mean, if the Jesus death and resurrection story is true, it literally means that the best stuff can come out of the worst stuff. Because there's nothing, I don't think any of us can imagine that's worse than deicide, the murder of God. But if new life can come out of that, then good Lord, there's all kinds of possibilities. And to have fidelity toward that and to bring that in relationship with others and not try to fix it for them, which this speaks into like things like how do we interact with people who are going through difficult things? How do we interact with ourselves going through difficult things? Well, you don't need to shame yourself or others
Right.
or fix it. Um, you carry it well. It's an honor to be a human being and to carry this stuff well.
Mhm.
You can never have a full answer or a complete thing. And maybe God doesn't, in my open and relational mindset, there's a sense in which God doesn't even really have a complete answer. God's with us trying to figure this out also. So that's a really beautiful approach to it.
Yeah. Well, we're heading a little past 9 o'clock. We have two more things I want to get to you from here. And one is a comment thanking you. The solidarity of God as exampled in your story is excellent. Love is omnipotent was presented in the presence of the darkness in the story that you told of Wiesel and all of our own grief and loss. So that has really, your conversations had a great impact with folks, but maybe to help with a lighter tone. Andy mentions, however, that you must be a fan of Seinfeld, the comedy about nothing.
Yeah, the show about nothing. Yeah,
The show about nothing.
I've never thought about that, but yeah,
Yeah,
I should be.
yeah. So, and that we do something on the first Thursday of every month. So if you've liked this and you want to come, there's always going to be something on the first Thursday of every month. And be sure that that Andrew has your email. And Jonathan, I can't tell you how profound and really wonderful it has been. I think for me, and certainly for all of us, to have this conversation with you, I wish you so much well, and for the contributions you're making into all these subjects that you've raised tonight. So if we just give them a hand or a wave or a thumbs up, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know I've only scratched the surface. I've probably introduced more questions than answers, but that's pretty much the way life is. And I also want to make sure I say hi to my friend Nancy DeLuca, who I've known for about 30 years, and she just lost her husband a year ago, just a little over. So love you, Nancy. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us, and be well, Jonathan. Be well, everybody who's on the call or the Zoom. It's been wonderful. Peace to all of you. And we hopefully will see you again next month. Okay. Thank you, Rebecca, for making this possible. We really appreciate it. It's been a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.